Hi, I'm Susan Weisbauer, co-author of The Well-Trained Mind.
And I'm Susanna Jarrett, editor at the Well-Trained Mind Press. And we're talking about education for all parents and for all children in all sorts of settings. And on today's episode, we are joined by a very special guest, an actual homeschool mom in the trenches, to talk about religious and secular homeschoolers and how we can support each other, even if we are coming from different backgrounds and have different reasons for why we chose to homeschool. So thank you so much, Jean Lee, for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. To share a little bit about myself, my work started by leading a class for my daughter. I started with a financial literacy class so that my child could learn with other students. And that very quickly grew into other classes, other community events, sharing my knowledge on the Academy of Chaos website and socials. And this year I launched an inclusive homeschool conference called the Midwest Homeschool Expo. I'm a mom who needed support for my own interfaith and transracial family, and I wanted to provide the same supports for others. I created opportunities where all are welcome. Everyone has a place to fit in, and the diversity brings value. My organization, the Academy of Chaos, it connects families in real world experiences, which I think is extremely important in the digital age, as well as online supports. And so far, I've encouraged thousands of families in the Midwest region. And it's humbling to know how far just a little bit of kindness, a little bit of generosity and time and knowledge can go.
Awesome. Well, thank you for joining us.
And we will put a link to your site in our show notes. So listeners, go check it out and see. So Jean, you and I probably have very different experiences of how we came to homeschooling and why we started to homeschool. So Susanna and I are going to just talk for just a sec about our perspective. So then you can offer an interesting contrast to that as seems appropriate. So although I am a Christian, I have never actually thought of myself as a faith-based homeschooler because I chose to homeschool primarily for family and academic reasons. I wanted to have that control over my kids' academic achievement. And also, we grew up on a farm. And when you're on a farm, having to meet the bus every morning and get the kids off the bus in the afternoon actually feels like such a huge burden. I know people have said to me, I could never homeschool. I just, it just would take all my time. And I always thought, but having to be tied to a school schedule would be so much harder, So I wouldn't call myself a faith-based homeschooler, but certainly having been in this world for 40 years now, I have seen how many faith-based homeschoolers sort of run everything that they choose, all of the decisions that they make, the conferences that they go to, the books that they choose, run that through the grid of their faith, and their theological convictions become the standard by which they choose almost everything having to do with their homeschooling. And I'm wondering how your experience is different from that.
Well, like many families, my life was changed in 2020. I had a child in public school. She was in first grade and she came home. And I knew immediately that online schooling for a child at that age was not going to work well for us. It wasn't going to meet her unique learning needs. And so we just got into the trenches and continued this journey because the benefits of shared time together, having a more connected family structure, and being able to offer deeper learning experiences is valuable. And I also share your sentiment of meeting the bus.
Right. Well, I'm so glad that you came on at that time, because I feel like a lot of folks were introduced to homeschooling during the pandemic, and whether they schooled at home and that wasn't really homeschooling, it was schooling on Zoom, which was really, really hard, or chose to exit that altogether and homeschool on their own. So many people came to homeschooling at that time. And so you bring that perspective of right now, I feel like the whole homeschool world has become much more diversified since COVID hit. So many more people for so many different reasons. So I'm glad you're here to represent that group, that incoming group of homeschoolers.
Now, Susanna, your family is conservative Christian, right? So what did you feel like were the reasons your parents chose homeschooling?
It was probably a bit more what you might call faith-based. I know that my parents in many ways wanted to keep us from things that they saw as negative in the public school system. So there was that more of that negative reason of keeping them out of something. But there was the positive reason too. And I actually recently had an interesting conversation with my older brother about how it's so important to have positive reasons for doing things. So instead of just homeschooling to keep you out of public school, to also have this positive vision of, but also we can, provide this tailored education and have more time as a family and tailor education to our kids' unique interests. And so I think my parents maybe came into it for more of the keeping us out of things, and then became really enamored with the homeschool vision as they read books like The Well-Trained Mind and built this positive vision for us. And ultimately, although they wanted to definitely instill a Christian worldview into their children, they wanted us to also have a secular education to the extent that we didn't go to college and not know what the theory of evolution was. Like, we were familiar with the things that would have been taught in a public school, but we were first introduced to it with a Christian worldview.
So, Jean, I'm wondering if when you started out, so you started this journey in 2020, so many of the conferences and so many of the curricula that are out there, and certainly the ones that have long track records, really are faith-based, because that was just one of the early motivations for people to homeschool. And I'm wondering if you had any difficulty locating curricula or finding support.
Well, when I started homeschool, I didn't know what I didn't know. I was home with little children and I dove in quickly. I read books, I read blogs, I watched reviews. I spent every night, all night when they were in bed, trying to figure out very quickly what was going to be the best course of action for us. And knowing at that point, my oldest was in first grade, knowing her well, I knew that online resources weren't going to be the best option. I knew that she needed hands-on project-based learning methodology. So that eliminated a lot of choices. But I looked at everything. You're right. The obvious suspects of the many faith-based curricula choices, I looked at them and said, would this work? And what I quickly realized was that the secular resources provided the most variety with broken out grade levels for core subjects. So something that was specific to my children was that my oldest and my middle started reading when they were 3. And that brought on a very difficult struggle in public school, which I didn't recognize at the time. I didn't know what twice exceptional meant. I didn't know what giftedness looked like. I didn't know the difference between giftedness and high achieving. I didn't even know how advanced or not advanced the gifted program in our public school was. I was so hands off when she wasn't home with me, not by choice, but that's the consequence of having your child in a public school district. I'm so fortunate to have this experience with her now and being so intimately involved in her education. So when I looked for options that were by grade level, by subject, I realized that all-in-one didn't work.
Right. So you mean like a set curricula, a whole like a curricula in a box.
Exactly. Curricula in a box, which a lot of people say, I just want all in one. I just want open and go without taking pause to consider I have an early reader or I have a late reader, or math is fast and easy, or it's a big challenge. And each child is different within a family. So having those subjects broken out can become very important. And being able to select, okay, we're in 6th grade, but we're not actually in 6th grade for each course subject. Some of them might be 2 grades ahead. If you're a mathy kid, you're going to be much farther ahead. And I didn't find those choices when I looked through faith-based curricula. So the specific...
Oh, that's interesting. Let me just stop you there for a minute. So that you were finding that the faith-based curricula you looked at tended to be more like complete curricula as opposed to sort of, pick and play, as it were?
Yes.
Oh, interesting. So you're thinking about, sorry, we're apologies to anybody who may be offended by this, but we're going to name names. So, so like Sunlight, for example, or I don't know, can you give me some examples of some of the faith-based curricula that you were like, wait, this doesn't give me enough flexibility for my individual child's needs?
I think the most popular one, and I have so many friends who use it, is The Good and the Beautiful. And it's a great curricula. It is literally beautiful and people love it. However, it's all together. And for us, we needed something that was different also for a specific learning methodology. And so when you're picking all in one, each subject is the same methodology as well. In our family, we use Singapore Dimensions Math because it includes 3 models for every lesson. That allows much more independent learning. She's able to find one of 3 models that helps her understand each lesson. She's able to sit down, read the lesson, go through the work. And if she doesn't understand something, chances are that one of the models is going to explain it well for her.
Gotcha. Interesting. This is just such a fascinating point to consider, is that with the faith-based curricula, a lot of the emphasis there is on worldview. So it makes sense that faith curricula would be sort of more integrated and like having you, do the whole thing all together. And I think that's a really important consideration for parents who are like me, are Christians and actually are looking for something that will reinforce a Christian worldview. It's important for them to consider what they might be giving up in terms of flexibility and adaptability if they are using one of these curricula that is, sort of like everything in one place. It's a very interesting philosophical difference, whether your curricula is designed to, I guess, educate the whole child, which is often a goal of faith-based homeschooling, as opposed to teach the kid how to do math, teach the kid how to write, teach the kid how to do grammar, and leave the educating of the whole child part to the family and to the parent.
Yeah. I remember when we were coming up, a big program was a Becca. It was an all-in-one. You could just purchase it. It had everything for you. And there's so much convenience in that. But we ended up, even though we were Christian, not choosing it for the very similar reason of my parents wanted to choose a history curriculum and a math curriculum and a science curriculum that fit our individual needs and had that flexibility.
So, Jean, what are some of the other curricula that you settled on that you consider to be, compatible with your wish to have secular curricula for your kids?
Sure. Something that's been really interesting through my journey is I saw a lot of families asking about curricula, and it's very expensive to purchase, and you can't just run over to Target and check it out before you buy or invest. And so one of the things I started doing was creating a viewing library. And now I have over 100 resources, almost all that's available. I have it in bins stacked up and I take it around with me to homeschool events, or if there's someone who's just starting that needs a little support, I say, come on over, let's look through it and see what you think might meet the needs of your family. And I have 3 very different children, so we have a lot of different options at our house.
And how old are your kids, Jean?
My children are 11, 6, and 3.
Okay, so you are right in the middle of it.
Right in the middle of it, which is awesome because I feel like I can be a great resource, having experienced multiple times now, several seasons.
Right.
Some of the curricula that I love is Easy Grammar is a super easy curricula to use for grammar learning. I also love Hate Grammar. If you have a child who is more interested in language arts and it's a strength for them and they want to focus on writing, it does the job. It's great. It's independent thinking. So if you have age gaps, which I do, it requires a lot of independent learning. You're jumping between children. The Singapore Dimensions Math is the same. Pandia Press is really heavy in hands-on learning. We love that. But I'll tell you, for history, we also love the story of the world because the way that I use it develops executive function. And another big reason why families choose secular resources is because, like my family, there is a high population of neurodivergent learners using home education. And so it's things like ADHD, autism, twice exceptional students, giftedness, dyslexia, dyscalculia, and a lot of those come with executive function deficits. So being able to do project-based, hands-on learning really helps develop those skills.
Yeah. So when you say that the story of the world helps with executive functioning, are you referring to like doing the projects using the activity book?
We do the projects using the activity book, and my favorite add-on is the Evan Moore History Pocket.
Oh, yeah, those are fun.
Another extension. And then we'll do things like create a diorama, or when we did the Ancients book, we laid out we used a big piece of paper from an Amazon packing box, and we laid it out like a giant scroll and glued on all kinds of the projects that were included in the activity book, projects from the Evan Moore books, and then others that we found online or created ourselves. And I'll tell you, we're in our third year, after doing all of those projects, it's a significant difference in the ability for spatial planning, for project creation. Now my oldest, she comes up with her own things. We don't even need to print out lap books anymore. She creates her own.
That's awesome.
I don't think I've ever heard anybody say that before. That's just such an interesting insight. I could be totally wrong about this, but I guess I tend to think that the faith-based resources that I'm familiar with really do tend to be more word-centered and less activity project centered, which I guess makes a lot of sense. But that's maybe just such another lens through which you can look at your curricula selection is what is that balance between more project centered learning, which can be great for kids who need more, spatial awareness. That's very interesting.
I'm curious if either of you have ever taken a curriculum that was faith-based. It had Bible verses in it or Christian worldview, but because the content was great, you were able to adapt it to your homeschool, or if you haven't done that so much?
Jean, you answer that first because I have many thoughts on that topic.
There are so many good secular resources available that I did not go. I've reviewed many of them as options. And then I thought, well, there's so many good resources available. I'm not going to go to the effort of trying to rewrite something. It was written with intention and love, and I'm going to leave it as it is. And it's going to meet the needs of some families in a great way, but I'm going to pick something that works better for my family.
And, I did not really use, I'm thinking through, no, I think probably the only really faith-based resource that I used for my kids was that we did use the Abeka grammar books, because I really couldn't find, I'm glad you love easy grammar, Jean, but I really hated it. And I just found it, I was like, this is completely inadequate. I think it was because when my own education was very language centered, I started Latin when I was in third grade, and having that sort of systematic teaching of grammar was the only thing that made sense to me. And with easy grammar, I was like, this is so random. I can't do it.
It's very easy.
Yes. Well, yes. Okay. Well, I won't get on my grammar soapbox. Just said we could do a hot takes on grammar episode, Susanna, that absolutely no one will listen to.
And it is interesting. I feel like the landscape has changed, because I remember even on the forums a few years ago, people lamenting, like, I want to use secular resources, but there's just nothing available. And now I'm hearing there's a wealth of resources available, which is great to hear. There's more available for different types of families. We used Apologia Science growing up, even though my family were not creationists. And every book had a full almost unit trying to sort of convince you of creationism. And that was interesting for me because my parents were creationists. And so that unit was like we still did it, but we also looked at other sources when we got to that point and kind of refuted the textbook in real time, which was actually kind of fun.
A rhetoric exercise.
It was a rhetoric exercise in the middle of my science program.
Yeah, well, rhetoric is applicable all across the board.
Right.
So,
I was going to say one of the things that I think is interesting and valuable to appreciate about the diversity in curricula choices, faith-based, secular, learning style or method, whether it's a literature-based curricula, whether it's a heavy science curricula, whether it's heavy writing, is that in homeschooling, my children get exposed to many of them because their friends all use something different. And so they talk about what they're learning. They talk about their methods. And I love the diversity of that. I love that they're experiencing different cultural perspectives, that they're hearing different stories and thinking about the lens that others see the world view through, that's valuable. Someday they're going to go on to jobs where everyone is going to be different, and they're getting a head start on that. They're getting a head start on good collaboration and strong relationships.
That's an interesting
So
point.
interesting.
Yes. Students will have they'll be coming from very different worldviews with the curricula they're in when they come to co-op or they go to social events with other homeschoolers. I love that.
We'll be right back.
Do your kids want to ask deeper questions about history, such as, would George Washington win a thumb wrestling match with a T-Rex? Well-Trained Mind Press is here to help. Our figures in motion sets let children bring history to life. Each set contains paper figures of people or creatures from a specific era in both pre-colored and color them in versions to cut out and assemble into movable action figures so your children can create their own historical adventures. Yes, the Genghis Khan figure comes with a falcon. Yes, Leonardo da Vinci comes with a paintbrush. No, we will not stop your child from making Albert Einstein and Joan of Arc take a heartwarming road trip. From the Jurassic period to ancient times to the modern age, there's a figures in motion set for every era. Available at welltrainedmind.com or wherever you buy books.
All right. Well, that kind of brings me to my next question, which is, you're in the homeschool space. There are faith-based homeschoolers, secular homeschoolers. Do you feel like there are any misunderstandings that other homeschoolers in your community have about secular homeschoolers that you wish you could explain?
Or do you have misunderstandings about faith-based homeschoolers that we could talk about? Both of these are good questions.
So I'll answer from my perspective as a secular homeschooler. I think homeschoolers are a very diverse group of people, not just faith-based or secular, but in methodology. And families who are described as secular, I think, are often thought of as not religious, when in reality, many of us are religious. There are Christians, Jewish families, Muslim, Hindi, as well as not faith at all, or like my family, interfaith families. And the largest divide is probably between faith-based and secular and the perception of that. But I don't really think it should be that way. We all share a common goal, and that's educating our children in providing the best that we can. That should align us. That should bring us together. I don't think that it should be a divide.
Absolutely.
So okay, so there's several different directions we could go from this, but let me go back, if you don't mind, to the story of the world for a minute, because I would be interested in your take on the inclusion of stories from books of faith, particularly in Story of the World 1. You say you consider yourself, to be a secular homeschooler. You're obviously using it without trouble or difficulty. But, I've gotten quite a lot of criticism from secular homeschoolers who say that there's too much Bible in it and that the Bible stories are treated differently than the stories from other faith sources. I don't actually think that that's a valid criticism, but it does seem to me that for a lot of people, secular means we're not going to talk about the Bible particularly at all. And I'm wondering if you have seen that attitude and how you think about that issue.
I have definitely seen that attitude, and it can be fierce. It can be fierce. That's pretty rough on you. But seeing cultural differences in the world is important. I really value that for my children, that they're hearing different stories from different faith perspectives, that they're understanding what other people believe, and that can give them more compassion in other people's choices. Why are they taking this holiday off? Why are they fasting today? Why are they wearing those kind of clothes? Why are they reading those books? What does that mean? And how can I be most supportive or inclusive for them? Understanding is important. I love that my children are reading stories of different faiths, and I think that the Story of the World represents many different faiths. We loved traveling the world through those stories and seeing the different adventures that take place. I tell my children, listen, books of faith are the best adventure stories you're ever going to read. They're exciting. There are heroes. There are villains, and you can take it for what it is. And everybody has a different perspective on that. But it is a beautiful introduction for early learners to the world and all of the things that that includes.
It's so interesting because I've gotten, of course, the same criticism on the history of the ancient world, which is my book for grownups that does the ancient world for Norton, because I really did take much of the same approach, which is to say, here are these stories in Genesis and Exodus that are the oldest tales that we have practically, from the human race. There's something that happened that's being recorded here. What is it? Even if you are not a person of faith, you can see the value of those stories and think critically about what was happening at that time, that those stories were considered so important that they needed to be retold and orally passed along and finally set down in some of the earliest alphabets that we know of. And, I've gotten the same reaction for the history of the world, which is, I read the first chapter and she's obviously a Christian apologist, so I threw the book away. You can go look on Amazon. There's a lot of that. But I just, I think that holy books we call them holy. People treasure them. There are stories in there that are true in a very, very deep sense, even if you don't necessarily agree with that particular theology that's being presented.
And one thing that's fun with the story of the world is being at conferences and stuff, I've gotten critique on both sides, which is to say it's too secular. There's not enough of the Bible. It presents Bible stories as if they're just stories, and then it's not secular enough. And I told that to someone who was asking me about it at the last secular homeschool conference I was at. She said, wait, I've heard this as a Christian curriculum. Is this secular? And I said, we get people who are mad at us from both sides, which I think means we're in about the right place.
Absolutely.
Well, and it's not just conservative Christians who get mad at us. There was for volume 2 of the Story of the World, which is the Middle Ages, we were subjected to a really intense pressure campaign from a very activist Muslim homeschool group, which was absolutely incensed at my description of Muhammad instructing his followers to attack a caravan. This is a story I took directly out of the Quran, but there was, and this was right after 9/11 too. So, it was very, very fraught that there was any theological basis in any Islamic teaching for violence, right? And it was there was a lot of pressure put on us to change that particular story. And I said, look, I know I'm not Muslim, and I know that, the way you feel about a holy book and about your tradition is important to you. But here is the text in the Quran. Here is what it says. And this is how I, as a historian, interpret it. And I'm not taking it out. But you can still, if anybody's interested, you can Google that particular controversy and find lots of stuff about it. So anytime you're dealing with sacred texts, somebody's going to get angry with you. But I'm curious, Jean, were there any points in the Story of the World where you stopped and said to your kids, well, that is clearly too Christian, or we disagree with this, or I don't want you to absorb that point of view? I'm just curious.
So the way that we use the Story of the World is that my oldest, who is 11, we're in our 3rd year, she'll read the text. And then at breakfast, our whole family will listen to the audiobook, because unique learners benefit from multiple inputs.
And a little Jim Weiss first thing in the morning, get you started for the day.
It's great. And my littles participate in the discussion as well. They ask questions. So I know the engagement is working. And we talk about the stories and they want to know, did that exactly happen?
Did that happen? Oh, the question.
Did that happen? And my perspective with learning is that you should always reference multiple sources and then determine the truth. It's the same with media. And we teach every adult this, that you can't trust what you read in the first newspaper article you see, correct? We should reference multiple sources. And so if they ask a question, did that really happen? I say, well, let's go get our Kingfisher encyclopedia and see what that says. And then let's go get a couple other books from the library and see what that says. And we do a comparison. Oftentimes the stories on whatever topic will be slightly different. And then we discuss that different authors have a different viewpoint. They use their own reference materials, and that's okay.
I love how you're using the story of the world to teach actual historical thinking skills like corroboration, and just starting them at that young age with looking at multiple sources. Sourcing, all those things are so important now more than ever. And like you mentioned, in the digital age, where we all kind of have to be historians, we all have to be able to sort through massive amounts of material and decide what we believe and what seems true and what we trust. And so that's a great way to get started, even at the grammar stage.
Well, and Susan can only make a book so long. She can only include so many details.
Right.
Thank you. That's the other set of letters I get is, why didn't you talk about this 19th century person who was obviously the most important person in the world, and you pretend like he doesn't even exist? I get a lot of that too.
Listen, Boudica became a hero at our house so much that when my middle was a baby, she was very fierce and she got nicknamed Boudica. Then my oldest, everywhere we'd go, she would ask other children, do you know about Boudica?
Love that.
The knowledge base that you have given my children is fantastic. So thank you.
And it'll make them great at cocktail parties when they're grown up. So I'm curious as to whether you have had either positive or negative interactions with faith-based homeschoolers, and you don't have to use any names, and you can disguise details in order to protect privacy. But what has your experience been? I guess maybe in person, but I feel like for homeschoolers now, like interacting online is almost, a bigger way in which we get either support or condemnation from other homeschoolers. And I'm wondering what your experience has been. Has it been positive? Has it been negative? What's it been like?
Well, I am a collector of friends, and
I love that.
I enjoy diversity. I find a lot of value in other people's perspectives. It makes my life and my children's lives richer by sharing other cultures. So I tend to seek that out. I tend to seek out people who are different because it's fun for us. It's enjoyable to share in those other traditions. But it's also not easy for us being different. As I mentioned, we are an interfaith family. I am a transracial parent. My children are not Caucasian. And so that puts us in a difficult position when many of the opportunities available, Christian organizations require a faith statement. We're excluded from that. So it can be difficult. However, when I have wanted opportunities for my children, I created it. That's how many of the things that I have built came about. The classes that I lead, the Midwest Homeschool Expo, I needed a support structure for my family. And I also sensed a need for others. And so I created spaces where all feel welcome. And that means everyone bring your faith perspective, whether you have one or not. It's okay to be authentic in who you are and bring that with you, but just don't force it on anyone else. And I think that's worked well. We all love learning with and from one another, and it becomes a great collaborative environment. From a negative perspective, as I mentioned, it's sometimes hard being different, and there can be criticisms whenever you create something new. Susan, you mentioned you've had some bummer moments with your books. And the stories that you told, you can't please everyone. Can never please everyone. But if I'm doing something that supports more than one other family, then I'm doing something well.
That's such, I think, a valuable reaction to homeschool organizations that have statements of faith. That your takeaway from that is, I am not welcome here, and my children are not welcome here. And I mean, I guess on the one hand, I understand why an organization would have a statement of faith. On the other hand, I feel like it's a leftover of the sort of like 1970s, 1980s emphasis on parachurch organizations as being the best way for Christians to sort of get out and interact with people who are not necessarily churchgoers. I mean, they're called parachurch organizations for a reason. They're not church, right? And so a parachurch organization, whether it's a youth organization like, Youth with a Mission or some other organization like that, if it has a statement of faith, it's still pushing people away. It's still saying you cannot come here if you do not subscribe to this. So, maybe I think it's a question that maybe more homeschool organizations should ask themselves. What am I achieving by having a statement of faith? And maybe even more importantly, who am I pushing away?
And I don't necessarily find fault or insult with organizations that have a statement of faith. I know that they are aligning with a specific moral ideology or a system that they want their organization to run by. That's okay. Not everybody is a forest schooler. Not everybody is a world schooler.
Everybody should be a forest schooler. What are you talking about?
Well, we're starting forest school on Friday, so we're pretty excited about that at our house.
Okay, you'll have to report back.
But I know it's not for everyone. Right. Just like everyone doesn't love Charlotte Mason style of learning, just like everyone doesn't love math or grammar or whatnot. It's okay. And there is a place for everyone. That's the beauty of a unique education. But I know that there just are not enough inclusive options. And so I made it a personal mission to build them.
So have you been to some of the more conservative faith-based homeschool conventions, any of the big ones?
Yes.
Tell me about it. We want to hear your reactions.
They do a great job at serving their intended population. They bring the resources together that those families are seeking. They provide support and presentations. I don't have anything bad to say. They do a great job of supporting the community they're trying to reach. I didn't find resources there for me. And so I needed to create something for other families like mine.
Well, and so I want to, as we'll wrap up here pretty soon, I want you to talk a little bit about the convention that you've put together, because one of my frustrations with particularly the really big faith-based homeschool conventions is that they kind of present themselves as not as faith-based organizations, but as homeschool organizations, right? So particularly if you're a new homeschooler and you don't really know anything about this world and you really just want to find a grammar book, you go into it expecting that these are going to be homeschool resources. And, from both the publisher and speaker end of things, I know that many of those conferences deliberately exclude very good educational resources, which don't line up with their theological or cultural worldview. And I think that's such a disservice to new homeschoolers who just see homeschool. That's what they see, and then they go in and they think, oh, I guess there really aren't any secular options for me. And they don't realize that there are other places to look.
So I woke up one day in February and said, I'm just going to do this. I'm going to make this event that is going to bring together all these resources that I love. And I'm going to make a safe place for all families to come and be authentic. And these moms every day that say, I need community, I'm just going to scoop them all up and make something awesome. In 15 weeks, I did, although I had no idea what a giant endeavor that was going to be. And I ended up with 54 unique presenters and 63 exhibitors, and 600 people showed up.
Oh, that's awesome.
That's amazing.
It was a big day. And I loved being able to represent all of the exhibitors, the curricula, the service providers, the activities, the online classes, the in-person classes that aren't included in any of the other events. There is no event like the Midwest Homeschool Expo in Indiana, or in any state that touches Indiana, or in any state that touches any of those states. And one of the other things that I did, because I'm a big collaborator, I know, particularly as a mom and a woman, when we support one another, we all succeed. And so I reached out to the other women that I saw doing similar things around the country. And through that journey, I made some really awesome friends. I found what they were doing. I shared my wisdom with them. They shared theirs with me. And that's been really, really cool too, to see how other women who are all moms, of course, in the homeschool community are creating the same types of villages around the country. One of the things that was really special about the expo was, first of all, the presenters. Some of them were women who it was their dream to speak at a homeschool conference. And they came to me in tears at the end and said, thank you so much for having me speak. This was a dream that I had, and you made that come true. Another thing that was really awesome was many of the exhibitors are small businesses. I invited companies that I know and love, I invited you, Susan, but you were already booked. So I just want you to know that. But I invited, listen, everybody on Bookshelf that I know is tried and true, that I personally tested out, games that I use in our learning, authors that have inspired my children. Chris Ferry presented from Australia. Now, I'll tell you, my littles love his science books. It was fantastic to support those small businesses. I feel like the impact of that is huge. When you support a small business, you're directly impacting a family's growth. You're not just supporting a giant empire. You're buying shoes for their kids. You're buying books for them to learn with, and matching them up as resources with families looking. That's amazing. I mean, that's really community building.
Okay, all you homeschool moms out there, you need to visit Jean's website and connect with her and put together your own inclusive conference. And I'll come speak if I can. I don't travel as much as I used to, but it does sound like it would have been a wonderful event to be at. And I'm so glad that energetic homeschool moms, and look, I had littles. I remember how tired I was all of the time, have the passion and the desire to do this. So I really hope that maybe from being on our podcast here, maybe you're able to make some connections and spread that wonderful goal of drawing other people in and supporting small businesses around this country, because that is just a fantastic and such a healthy thing for parents who are educators.
You know, we're all moms doing the very best we can and trying to survive on any given day. And so trying to raise kind and generous humans, being a reflection of that in ourselves is what lifts us all up.
That's so well put.
Jean, I thank you so much for coming. I'm inspired by this, that you created the space that you wanted to be in when you couldn't find it. You just made it. That's amazing. And please remind us where folks can find you on the internet.
My website is www.theacademyofchaos.com. I also am Jean Lee, the Academy of Chaos, on Facebook, Instagram, Pinterest. And this year I'll be starting a YouTube channel to talk more about my journey and share how I use the learning tools, things like the story of the world and how we've used that to really develop our executive function skills, how I combine books and learning for special learners. So I hope I will see you there or even meet you in the wild.
In the grocery store.
Right.
There you go.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
No, so we've really enjoyed talking to you.
Thank you for listening to the Well-Trained Mind podcast. You can find Susan at facebook.com/susan.wise.bauer and Susanna on Instagram at hopintohomeschool. Our engineering and mixing is done by AJ Falari at ajfalari.online. This podcast is produced by Well-Trained Mind Press, and our supervising producer is Chris Bauer. If you enjoyed the show, help us out by rating and reviewing us wherever you listen to podcasts. If you have questions, responses, or ideas for future episodes, email us at podcast@welltrainedmind.com. We'll be back next week, so stay tuned.